Hello, I'm Jacob Jockson, and today we're going to be talking about Larry Itliong and his legacy throughout the Filipino community. I am a sophomore in college majoring in finance, and I am joined today by my sister, Kayla Jockson.
Hello, my name is Kayla. I graduated from Boston University in 2023 with a major in film and TV and a minor in African American Studies. After graduation, I went on to work in digital media for an Asian American company that celebrates and promotes AAPI talent in the entertainment industry.
Today, we're going to be talking about Larry Itliong, who was a Filipino immigrant who traveled around Central California doing farm work. He was a key player in the labor union, which is mostly accredited to Cesar Chavez. While he is a well-known name amongst the Filipino community, he is widely unknown in history. We will be exploring his legacy and the neglect/erasure of Larry Itliong's work. Now, some questions I have for my sister is, one, how did you first hear about Larry Itliong?
So the first time I heard about Larry Itliong, I was in 7th grade when my middle school in the Bay Area was changing their name to Itliong Veracruz Middle School. It was predominantly AAPI students, probably around 70%, and it was actually the first school in America to be named after a Filipino American. And it's interesting because the other school in the area, or the other middle school, was renamed a few years before to Cesar Chavez Middle School.
That's really interesting. A little bit of how I first heard about him is through my family. My mom, my grandparents told me about Larry Itliong, but I never really understood because I was never taught about him outside of my family. Honestly, I thought they were just making him up. Anyways, next question. So, do you think his story is well represented amongst the Filipino community versus non-Filipino communities?
I definitely think it depends where and when you grew up. I think for us, with a mother from the Bay Area who studied Asian American Studies in college, we were definitely bound to hear the name. Within the larger Filipino community, I think anyone interested in Filipino American history will eventually run across the name, but their story is very central to California Filipinos. A lot of Filipinos in California immigrated here when work was needed in the Central Valley in Northern California, and a lot of little Manilas were established during this time in cities like Stockton and Delano. And as a result, the Manong generation is not just a story that's told, but it's central to people's family history. Having gone to school on the East Coast, I know that there's a large Filipino community in the Midwest and the East Coast who don't have that same admiration for the Filipino farm workers. And that's simply because they don't really know about them. In a non-Filipino community, I think it's very unlikely that you'll ever even hear his name pop up. I remember in high school when we were talking about Cesar Chavez's impact on labor rights, I mentioned Larry Itliong and Philip Veracruz, and my teacher had said that she'd never even heard of these people. So their story is definitely not widespread.
I think that's really interesting because it shows not really a lack of care, but just an ignorance that is kind of sad to hear about as a Filipino, because it feels like we aren't cared about, especially in mainstream media. The next question is, how has hearing about Larry Itliong's story maybe changed your view of American history or altered it? Or
I think I've always kind of had a general idea that Filipino and POC stories as a whole are written out of history. When I was in the 5th grade, I was taught that Magellan was killed in the Philippines before he could complete his tour around the world. But in reality, he was coming to the Philippines with the intent to conquer and colonize. So I don't think this story in particular changed how I view anything, but it does reinforce my thought process to decentralize whiteness and reinsert POC stories into the narrative.
I mean, I fully agree. As a Filipino American specifically, I've always liked to learn about these Filipino stories that I haven't heard about. I remember in high school doing a paper on Lapu-Lapu, who is the Filipino that killed Magellan. And it's just a very interesting story, and it helps me ground myself and get in tune with my roots. Furthering that question, um, now, why do you think that like stories such as these are rarely taught in schools?
There's a lot. I think specifically with Larry Itliong, it boils down to the fact that he was a really radical thinker. He threatened American labor and at like its core, white supremacy. He had a history in unions and community organizing. Um, Before the labor unions had united to form the United Farm Workers, if Filipinos were striking, Mexican labor workers broke the picket, and vice versa. But when Larry Iliong recognized that and started working with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, it was really groundbreaking. Um, and you also have like a lot of like figures in this story, right? When the unions united to form the UFW, Chavez became the face of that. Itliong was like an immigrant, and on top of that, he was militant and blunt. And he recognized that Filipino workers received the short end of the stick and resigned from the UFW a couple years later. And after that, the movement really began to like omit his contribution entirely.
Do you think that Larry Itliong's radical ideas and his radical nature could be a reason why he's overshadowed by figures like Cesar Chavez?
Yeah, I definitely think that. I think Cesar Chavez, being a nonviolent, religious individual, born in America, he was the perfect person to kind of pedestal in this movement within American history. And I think American history, like as it's taught today, is very careful with who they teach and who they omit in order to protect white supremacy. I think it's the same reason we focus on Martin Luther King Jr.'s like nonviolence and messaging, but we try very hard to avoid the impact that Malcolm X or the Black Panthers had in grassroots organizing. When people are radical and talk about inequalities within a system, that education is too dangerous to the American status quo. And I think Larry Itliong was an important figure that united two movements, and the results of that is the labor rights that we have today, like rights to unions, minimum wage, clean drinking water, lunch and bathroom breaks. They all seem very basic to us now, but back then it was revolutionary. And the only revolutionary thinkers that our society can glorify are like the people, our founding fathers from the 1700s.
I think that's a really interesting point. While doing research on Larry Itliong, it came to me in an article I read that Larry Itliong was the one who pushed Cesar Chavez to start the walkouts and the strikes, and without Larry Itliong, it could have taken maybe 5, 10 more years for the strikes to even happen or occur, which is really important to show his drive and the passion that he had, which like helped get a lot of things started. Furthering that thought, do you think that this erasure of a Filipino leader was intentionally done or just due to neglect?
Well, I think it could be argued that it was both, right? Intentionally, Chavez is like a very digestible union leader. He's English speaking, American grown, nonviolent. He had like representation in the media. In comparison, you have someone who was an immigrant, blunt, and militant, right? So I think Chavez in the beginning was cherry picked to be the face of this movement. And as history moved along, the name Larry Itliong was lost. And as someone who like studied film, my main focus is like how people of color are represented in media and entertainment. And there are so many like documentaries about Cesar Chavez and his work, which, was important. But very few of these mention the Filipino farm workers and their impact. And if they do, it's only accessory to the work that Chavez led as like president of the UFW. So I think like the mainstream media that we consume is another like form of passing down these stories of American heroes, and another reason why Larry Leong's name was kind of lost to history.
Now, I know you talked about this a little bit, where Filipino Americans on the East Coast weren't aware of the Filipino farmers. So I'll gear this question more towards Filipino Americans in California. But do you think that Filipino Americans are aware of this history, specifically Larry Itliong and Philip Veracruz?
So, like, to a level, yes, I think California specifically is really rich with Filipino American history. So, growing up here, Filipino American is really a privilege. Going to school out of state, I have Filipino friends from all over the country, and even some friends who are Filipino nationals. So, we all have different understandings of Filipino American history. Some of them look at Filipino American celebrities and like want to claim like Bruno Mars and Olivia Rodrigo as the first people to do anything significant in like Filipino American history because they're the like real household names who have like financial and social capital. Some of my friends are children of like nurses and healthcare professionals, so they want to say like that is our big contribution to American society. But I think to be aware of Filipino history and Filipino American history, you really need to like do research and learn about like not just like the stories of like Larry Itliong, but like all of the stories of like Filipino people in America. You have like the Igorot people who were brought to the World Fair in cages as an exhibit, and you have like the Manila men who established the first settlement of Asian Americans in Louisiana. And you even have like the annexation of the Philippines after the Philippine-American War. And through all of these, like the Philippines has a very long history of resilience and solidarity and fighting against their oppressors, both in America and the Philippines. And once Filipino Americans kind of have an understanding of that, you kind of have like a strong foundation for like why Filipinos are so proud of like their heritage and culture.
I think that's an excellent point. Is there any tips or advice you want to give listeners to learn more about their history and help spread awareness?
Yeah. Well, I think like community involvement is really important. Like for us, we wouldn't know Larry Itliong if it wasn't for our mom, and she probably learned it through her community as well. Like I said before, like researching, like cultural research is really important. For me personally, like I love hearing like immigrant stories, and I used to talk to our grandfather about like his move to the Bay Area from the Philippines at a time when immigration from the Philippines was really high. I think like personalizing historic moments is really important to understanding what was going on at the time. And once you have that personal tie, it becomes like a passion to kind of spread awareness.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. I think that storytelling is an important part of spreading history, culture, and enriching not just the current generation, but future generations. Help keep alive like emotion and passion within people who weren't alive or just simply weren't there to experience that moment in time. Now, the final question is, what role do you think storytelling plays in activism and justice today?
I think storytelling plays a really important role in activism and justice. On a personal level, I think it shapes how we can like move forward in the face of adversity. As someone in the entertainment space, I think that like it provides like a very empathizing like nature to kind of understand what other people are going through. But yeah, I think it's really important. Period.
Okay. Now, well, ending with that, I'd like to thank you, my sister Kayla Jackson, for joining me on this podcast, and I'd like to thank you, the listener, for listening to this podcast. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. Like, comment, and subscribe.